We are delighted to have in our studios Margaret Ng. She's Hong Kong's leading politician, barrister, writer, columnist. She has been an integral part of Hong Kong's life for the last 4 decades. Margaret, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Margaret, the Hong Kong Occupy movement, which was called the umbrella movement, has caught the attention of the world that something is going on in Hong Kong that requires or that kind of inspires hundreds of thousands of people to come to the street. Now, for our audience, if you could give us a little sort of maybe potted history as to how we came to this point when a 79 days Occupy movement, the world's longest Occupy movement, took place in Hong Kong.
It is really very, very astonishing that it lasted nearly 80 days. Another astonishing thing is that it's mainly moved by the young generation, the generation who said Hong Kong is my future, I should be master of my own fate. I have waited long enough for this democratization process to happen in Hong Kong. Let us see real democracy. We don't want the Beijing package. That is the thrust of it.
So bring us through this. What is the democratic package that people are asking for, and what was the original deal? When in 1997, Hong Kong sovereignty was transferred by the British to China. Chinese did promise something. And so tell us what happened.
It really goes back 30 years to 1984, when Britain and China signed the joint declaration. On the one hand, Britain will hand Hong Kong back to China. On the other hand, China says that after they resume the exercise of sovereignty, they would practice a 12-point policy on Hong Kong. And basically, Hong Kong systems will remain unchanged. The legal system, the way of life, protection of rights, and so on. It will have its own executive power, its own legislature, and so on. But the basic thing is to preserve the existing Hong Kong system, save and except that it would be under Chinese sovereignty.
Yeah, I think the wording was that excepting defense and foreign affairs, Hong Kong would be granted a high degree of autonomy.
Absolutely. The high degree of autonomy was really necessary because China runs under a socialist system. They are a socialist state. They are run by the Chinese Communist Party. Hong Kong was a colony, but Hong Kong had the rule of law, and Hong Kong had an open sort of life. And so some sort of insulation, if you want to keep Hong Kong system, then you've got to put Hong Kong people in charge. It's really as simple as that.
So the Joint Declaration in 1984, and then the Basic Law was drafted in
1990. Yes, the part of the Joint Declaration was, China has this 12-point policy. How is it going to be guaranteed? Of course, the Joint Declaration itself was an international treaty.
Between Britain and China.
Between Britain and China. And it was registered in the UN, and the world has the right to monitor how it happened, how it was going to be implemented. But part of the Joint Declaration was this 12-point policy was not merely an expression of a wish. China also said that this is going to be enshrined in a basic law under the Chinese Constitution. So it has a very special position in Hong Kong. It guarantees its legal basis, its powers, and its autonomy.
So what happened was, in practical terms, the LegCo, Legislative Council, was consisting of elected
people
from functional groups.
Yes, ultimately it was very unsatisfactory at the point of transition because less than half of the legislative body was elected by real election, direct geographical elections. We have half of the legislature elected by what is known as functional constituencies, basically a privileged position of business interests, vested interests, professional groups, and so on. So on the one hand, the real elections, less than half of the council were elected by more than 3 million. The other half was elected by something like 250,000 voters, and many of them were not human beings. So it was a very
lopsided.
Very lopsided. But we were hoping, and it was promised in the Basic Law, that gradually it would become more and more democratic until ultimately every member, every seat would be returned by direct geographical election.
Universal suffrage.
Universal suffrage. And also, of course, the election of a chief executive.
So from 1997, the LegCo indirect elections, and then they elected the chief executive, who was essentially a Beijing candidate, but formalized.
Yes, and you're quite right to use the word formalized, you know, because everyone knows that that person is handpicked by Beijing. And then he goes through a kind of so-called election process. But the people who elected him actually come from the functional constituencies, and they form into an election committee of 800 and then progressed to 1,200, but basically they were the same basis, and they elected the person that Beijing wants to elect.
Yeah, and so that thing has continued, and then Beijing promised some reform.
Yes.
And the reform that they promised was announced in August last year.
That's right.
So that was, tell us what happened then.
That was the last straw. I think that people have been very, very patient. They understand that this is going to be a gradual process. But several years ago, Beijing promised that in 2017, the chief executive could be elected by universal suffrage. So everyone was waiting to see what happens, what was the model supposed to be for 2017. And the model turns out to be, in effect, Beijing will choose the candidates, 2 or 3 of them, and then Hong Kong people would vote on these candidates. So this is not really allowing people to choose their candidates or choose their chief executive.
Because universal suffrage means 2 things. Everybody votes, every adult person votes, and every adult person has a right to contest the election.
Yes, you are free to stand for election, and you are free to elect the candidate of your choice. That's the basis of universal suffrage.
In the Chinese definition of universal suffrage,
it's a universal suffrage with Chinese characteristics.
Is that you vote, but I choose the candidate.
Yes. Well, there are still people who feel that, well, even so, it is not so bad, because even if you have only 2 or 3 candidates, and even if all of them are accepted by Beijing, the race, the election campaign, the contest in the election, if there is a real contest, there will still be a democratization process. But I don't think anything of the sort, because if Beijing gets to pick the candidates, Beijing would avoid any kind of real election, real contest, because the one basis on which Beijing can give you a kind of one person, one vote is that if they can predict, if they can identify who is going to be elected from the very start. The last election committee meeting didn't turn out well, although both of the real candidates were pro-Beijing. Because when you have the pro-Beijing factions fighting each other, in fact, it was more damaging to Beijing.
But anyhow, so the point is that when the Chinese government announced this so-called reform, then the students said they wouldn't accept it. And so
basically, I think that everybody was very shocked, and they felt many people who have been waiting patiently became very, very disillusioned, and they feel that this is really going too far. There is actually no opening and no chance for it to develop, because Beijing says this is universal suffrage, take it or leave it. And so Hong Kong people were looking for a way of expressing that dissatisfaction. But the students became the leaders in expressing this dissatisfaction. They started with a very mild, peaceful class boycott. They sat in the park near government quarters. They held classes there and so on. But the sit-in was suddenly shattered because of the strong hand, the harsh way they were dealt with, the police stopped people from joining the rally, then tear gas were released, and so that really exploded. The umbrella movement really exploded in this way.
So people who are somewhat indifferent, they were energized by the police action.
Yes, they were. Hong Kong people were very mild. But when the government overreacts and when very unreasonable actions were taken, they get very angry and they rush to the site to support the students. That's why from a few thousand, they became tens of thousands of people, and they decided to occupy the very central parts of the city.
And so they occupied. And tell us about how this occupation could continue for so long. What did they do about food, about water? What was
It was really very amazing. It was, I would say that it happened almost by accident, because although for 2 years there were people who were thinking of a movement called Occupy Central with love and peace, so it was going to be a very peaceful civil disobedience movement. They were all going to sit in the banking area waiting to be arrested. But that didn't happen. It happened in a totally different way. When the police fired tear gas into the crowd and they were forced to stay on the site, then that was a totally different situation. That becomes a different kind of occupy. Now, when people were there and they had to stay there, then you have people going there with food, with donations of water, of medical care. You have tents set up to look after the people who were occupying the place and so on, so as to continue with this a peaceful demonstration. It was a very bizarre sort of situation.
So it was in some ways, it was a mini city with a municipal government.
Yes. Yes.
Because people are bringing in food, there was a medical station set up to take care of.
You see, when at first people didn't expect that it would be prolonged in this way. So they were just sleeping on the ground, and they some of them would have to go away during the day. But as they stayed on, then they start to have longer term things. They have to set up tents. Then the students there don't want to leave the homework behind. So you have to have areas for the students to study. And because people were staying there for on a long term, the whole day basis, they needed food, they needed water, they needed to be taken care of, and because there were alarms of police crackdown from time to time, so there has to be medical centers in case anyone is unwell to be taken care of, and so on. So in the beginning, there was a tension of police crackdown happening anytime. But as the situation just sort of become very uncertain, and people just stayed there, and they didn't know when it was going to end. And so they become a kind of self-educating, self-governing community. And that was what lasted for 80 days.
So there seems to have been a period when the government was really getting ready to crack down.
In the beginning, yes.
And then they changed their tactic.
It was very strange because, here were the anti-squad, anti-riot squad, which was a very serious matter. And they were prepared with banners to say, disperse or we shoot. So everybody had memories of Tiananmen and everybody was very, very anxious. And then suddenly action was called off. People were warning the students to go away because you must value your life, you must save yourself, don't stay here, it is dangerous. And this went on for a couple of days. And then after action was called off, we don't know what happened next, but students seem to be kept there on the site.
So one can surmise that authorities in Beijing saw that to have even a mini Tiananmen situation in Hong Kong was damaging for a financial center.
Of course. Can you imagine having the kind of Tiananmen scene happening in the central of Hong Kong? When it happened in Beijing, the foreign press cannot monitor it. They had to go away. They were shooed away. But Hong Kong is a very open city, And just as China was trying to tell the world we are a strong economic power and we want to take our place in the world stage, they don't want a kind of mini Tiananmen happening in Hong Kong. And I think that it was perfectly possible that it was Beijing which called off the action. Mm-hmm. But who knows?
And perhaps they calculated that the disruption of life, if it continued for a long time, the support for the movement would dwindle. And that's what happened, right?
Yes, part of this. So they changed tack. They think that if they would let things drag on, this Occupy would inconvenience people. People would get very irritated, and support for the occupiers, the protesters, will turn into opposition, and the protesters will go away. And in any event, when they finally cleared the site, there was very little opposition. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, what's very interesting is that those 79 days actually helped a kind of bonding of these very special group of people. They were talking to each other all the time, and the overwhelming topic was, what is our future? How can we make Hong Kong work? If we allow this government to run on according to the present lines, we're not going to get anywhere.
So this 79 days actually served as a kind of intense education for the students.
Yes.
Because they were trying to understand all the legal niceties, and actually you also played a role in terms of giving some seminars to the students.
The students were there. The supporting members of public were there. They were determined to occupy the place and not go away. But what they were doing there was also discussing, in a both theoretical and a practical sort of way, solutions for Hong Kong's future. So people like us were invited to give talks to them on democracy, on the rule of law, on community building, on all sorts of things. And they were listening to all these talks very eagerly. They asked very good questions. So it was almost a crash course in democracy and the rule of law. And I think that if there was one message which got to them, and I want to emphasize that this group of protesters were very different. There is a generational change as well as a change of positioning. In my generation, we think that the thing is to voice what we consider to be our rights and our wishes, and the powers that be, should see to it that our wishes are carried out. But the new generation of protesters take possession of the issue. They say this is our responsibility. So our task is to find out how we can do it. And so educating people like this is a great pleasure. So I think they will change Hong Kong.
So the education was not only for the students, but actually the world got educated about Chinese way of dealing with international law, because when the British parliamentarians were planning to come to Hong Kong, the Chinese government said you are not welcome, and announced that the joint declaration is now void. So tell us, what does it mean, this voiding of an international agreement?
To my generation, I mean, to the people in the Umbrella Square, they were mostly concerned with their own future in their city. What is Hong Kong's future going to be? And they were trying to work that out. For the older generation like us, because we know how Hong Kong got to the place that it is now, and the basis is a joint declaration and the basic law. So the umbrella movement sparked off a debate in the House of Commons in Britain. They say, well, how has our government been monitoring the implementation of the joint declaration? Why is the umbrella movement happening? And so there was a debate in the House of Commons. And it was in the debate that suddenly they were told that they have no standing, Britain had no standing to monitor what's happening in Hong Kong because the joint declaration is now void. Then the void meaning what?
So the joint declaration said that Hong Kong would maintain its style of life for 50 years. In other words, until 2047.
That's correct.
The agreement would hold, and Britain naturally would have a say in the upholding of that agreement.
To put it very, very in a very simple terms, Hong Kong was returned to China on the promise that China would give Hong Kong a high degree of autonomy. Now, Hong Kong has been returned to China. And are you telling me that the second part is now void?
Yeah.
I mean, that doesn't make sense. So I think this is important not only for Hong Kong. Hong Kong will find its way forward, and we want to build our future on the promise of the Basic Law. And if this is not going on, then people will have to ask, how would they safeguard their future? But for the world, there is a greater significance. How can an international bilateral treaty be unilaterally declared to be void by one of the signing parties?
Yeah, and what does it then tell about the reliability of China as a partner in international agreements?
Of course, when you think about the rule of law, then this is, if a country refuses to be bound by the very treaty that it has signed, and now it says that only the returning Hong Kong to China part is bilateral, the other part is unilateral, then you have to think about China again. You have to look at China in a new light. What kind of an international player it is. But I think the more practical part of it is this. That is, the whole world cared about the Joint Declaration 30 years ago because so many international members of the community was trading in Hong Kong, they were living in Hong Kong, they were doing business in Hong Kong, the international press was in Hong Kong. If you want to learn anything about China, Hong Kong is the best place. Now, are you going to change all that? Are you going to say that none of this will be maintained? And if so, how is the world going to do business in Hong Kong? With China or with each other? There are some people who think that because China is now economically successful, Hong Kong is now dispensable. I don't think that this is the case at all. And if you ask people who do business in Hong Kong, it is because they rely on the legal system. They rely on the rule of law. They know that their rights are protected by law. They know that there is freedom of information. And if that is why, when the freedom of the press is affected, people sit up and say they get really concerned. So I don't think that it is a matter of just for Hong Kong people because they want democracy, because they want to have a control over their own city, which I think is all very legitimate, but also because what is Hong Kong going to become if Hong Kong cannot run its own systems?
So all this looks a bit depressing, but from what I gather is that the students are not depressed, although the movement has ended.
Yeah, I am not depressed. I have to say that although it is, you're right that it is depressing to see that there's so much pressure and there's so much that China is being so very stubborn and so difficult to communicate, refuses to communicate, that its priorities are so very different from Hong Kong's priorities, and matters are urgent, and we find it very difficult to move forward. All these are very depressing. But I'm not depressed for two reasons. One is that the world is noticing Hong Kong again. They start to ask again, is the joint declaration spent? Do we now still need the guarantee that China is going to honor its promise? And international concern is extremely important. Secondly, the new generation has brought in new energy. They are no longer prepared to sit there and wait for democracy to come to them. They are no longer content for someone else to look after the rule of law. They are prepared to give their energy into the future of Hong Kong to protect these systems. And I think this is wonderful. You know, if you don't struggle for your future, you have no hope. Democracy will never be given to you on a plate. And the rule of law will not be maintained just because the government thinks that it is a good thing. You've got to protect it all the time. Eternal vigilance. And they've learned how important it is. They've gone through the umbrella movement. I don't think that they are going to be the same people again. So we have a very energetic and very, very I think they have very mature minds.
And they have been sort of transformed by this experience.
They have been utterly transformed by the experience, and there is a new bonding there. And I don't think anybody can take that away.
Well, on that hopeful note, thank you very much, Margaret Ng,
Thank you.
for coming to our studio. Thank you.